When losing everything is the first step to life's greatest victory. Imagine you have it all: a stable job, a seemingly perfect relationship, and a planned future. But suddenly, everything falls apart in a single instant. What would you do if you lost everything you had, without even knowing how to start over? This is the story of Michael, a man who, after hitting rock bottom, discovers that losing everything was actually the first step toward the greatest victory of his life. Prepare yourself for a journey of pain, overcoming, and, above all, redemption, which will show you how, sometimes, the end is just the beginning of something much greater. There are times in life when it seems like we're doing well, that everything is finally falling into place. Routine seems under control, the future looks promising, and a sense of stability envelops us like a protective blanket. But in the blink of an eye, life can turn upside down. And that's exactly what happened to Michael. Michael, like many of us, led an ordinary life, without any major surprises or major setbacks either. He had a job that paid the bills, a stable relationship with the woman of his life, and was building plans for a future that seemed secure. The daily routine, the conversations with friends, the hot coffee on Monday mornings, all of this seemed to indicate he was in control of his life. However, a sequence of tragic events would relentlessly tear him out of that comfort zone. It all started with news that, at first, seemed harmless. Michael arrived at work on a morning like any other, only to be summoned to his boss's office. He entered the room and greeted his boss with a smile, unaware of what was to come. When the word restructuring was mentioned, he could barely grasp the gravity of what was being said. The market was changing. The industry he worked in was being hit by an economic crisis that showed no signs of improving. "Unfortunately, we are being forced to make cuts," his boss said, before announcing that Michael was among the employees who would be laid off. Suddenly, Michael found himself facing an uncertain future, without the stability he believed he had. The loss of his job was the first blow, a blow that seemed simple to outsiders, but one that profoundly shook the confidence and security he had in himself and his life. If the loss of his job had already been difficult to digest, what came next seemed impossible to believe. A few days after being laid off, Michael arrived, home to a heavy silence. The woman he'd thought he'd build a lifetime with stood in the center of the living room, looking at him with teary eyes but a determined expression. "Michael, I don't know if I can go on anymore," she said, her voice low, almost broken. The conversation that followed was painful. She explained that although she still loved him, things had changed between them. Emotional distance had set in, and she could no longer ignore the feeling they were on different paths. Michael tried to argue, tried to salvage what was left, but she was firm in her decision. The relationship that had seemed solid, that he believed unbreakable, ended in a silent exchange of keys and blank stares. He stood there, completely stunned as she walked away, leaving a shadow of doubt and regret. As he struggled to cope with the pain of losing his job and his relationship, something even more devastating happened. News struck like a bolt from the blue. His mother, with whom he had a strong bond, was gravely ill. It was terminal cancer, diagnosed too late for any effective treatment. The loss of his mother wasn't just an emotional tragedy. It was the final straw. The pain of watching her struggle with the disease was overwhelmed by the helplessness of being unable to do anything to change the situation. Michael watched her wither day after day, like a flower losing its petals in the wind, until the inevitable moment when she was gone, losing his job, his relationship, and then the most important person in his life in such a short space of time, left him feeling utterly helpless. That feeling of having lost everything, of being completely alone in the world, gripped Michael in a way he never imagined. He was paralyzed, unsure of what to do, powerless to get up or find a new purpose. He wondered how he could have come so far and yet lost everything so abruptly. What was happening to him? What else could happen? It seemed as if fate had destined him for a path of endless suffering. Michael's breakdown wasn't just about material losses or relationships. It was a profound loss of his very identity. Who was he without his job? Without the woman he loved? Without his mother's constant presence? Each of these pieces of his life represented a fundamental part of his essence. When they were ripped away, he found himself empty, lost in a sea of uncertainty and insecurity. At this point, many of us would find ourselves so broken, so immersed in pain, that it would be almost impossible to believe anything positive could come from it all. But Michael's story is far from one of permanent defeat. Just when you think life has taken everything it could, it is precisely in this moment of fragility that the opportunity for a new beginning lies. Have you ever found yourself at such a low point as Michael? Have you ever lost something or someone so important that you thought you'd never get back up? What would happen if, in that moment of pain, you found the strength to take the first step toward your transformation? Michael didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that losing everything could, in fact, be the beginning of a victory greater than he ever imagined. Michael's journey was just beginning, and what he didn't know was that pain and loss would be the catalyst for something much greater. How would you react then, if everything you knew was taken from you? Would it be the end? Or would it be the moment you discovered that the greatest victory of your life was right in front of you, waiting to be won? If you identify with Michael's story, or feel that life has challenged him in ways you never imagined, don't miss the next chapter of this journey of redemption. And if this story touched you in any way, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel to follow every step of this incredible transformation. The best is yet to come. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the white walls of the room. The silence was oppressive, like a weight on his chest. He could still smell her perfume on the pillow, the faint impression of her presence on the table beside him. Now only loose papers and a few photos he hadn't had the courage to put away remained. The house was empty, and with it, Michael's life seemed to have lost its color. It was a cold morning, but he didn't feel the coolness of the icy air outside. The window was ajar, but he didn't even notice the breeze coming in. He'd lost the ability to feel the little things that once gave life to his day. What was left of him? What was left of the person he'd become, now that work, love, and even his mother were gone? He stared at the phone on the table. For days, no one had called him. His friends, the few who had once been close, began to disappear. Or maybe he was the one pushing them away. He didn't even care anymore. When you lose everything you thought was essential, casual conversations lose their meaning. How are you? Seemed to echo in a void, with no desire for a response. Why respond? To say what? That he was fine? That he was okay? But he wasn't. He was drowning in loneliness. He even tried to deal with the loss of his job rationally. He knew the market was bad, that the world was in crisis. But the real pain came from the fact that he no longer knew who he was without that job. He had always seen himself as successful, someone with a mission, a direction. Now, he was just a shadow, wandering from one room to the next, unsure of what to do with his hands, his mind. Every attempt to send out a resume seemed futile. The feeling of rejection was overwhelming. And when the phone didn't ring, he wondered, am I the problem? Does the world simply not need me anymore? But it was the loss of Laura, the woman with whom he shared dreams and plans for the future, that truly shattered him. Their relationship, which he thought was rock solid, crumbled one ordinary afternoon. She was no longer there. No longer by his side. There was no more laughter, no more quiet conversations on the couch at night. There was nothing left, just emptiness. She left without a backward glance, and Michael didn't know if he wanted another explanation or just silence. In that moment, he felt helpless. He didn't know what to do. Trying to follow her decision seemed even more painful. There was no going back. And then, the news of his mother. He could still hear her voice, soft, calm, always urging him to take care of himself. But now she was far away, no longer in his life. She was gone, leaving Michael with a hole in his chest that no words could fill. He thought he could bear it all. The lost job, the ruined relationship. But losing his mother? No. This was more than he could bear. He didn't know what to do with this emptiness. He didn't know how to move forward without her. He felt lost. The room he now called home was filled with memories that couldn't be erased, but also couldn't be revisited. The smell of her morning coffee, the sound of her cell phone ringing in the night. All of it became more unbearable with each passing day. There was no longer any comfort in what had once brought him happiness. There was no longer any room for hope. The weight of life was slowly crushing him. He found himself in an abyss, at the bottom of a deep well where the light barely reached. The nights were endless, the days endless. The reflection in the mirror showed a man he no longer recognized. The baggy clothes, the tired, empty eyes, the stubble. He was disconnected from himself, and this terrified him more than anything else. He no longer had the will to get out of bed, to shower, or to eat. Everything seemed like an exhausting effort, a slog he no longer had the strength to do. Michael tried to find comfort in a few things. The few friends he had left tried to console him, but he felt disconnected from everything. They talked about things that no longer seemed to make sense. For them, life went on. Things changed, and he found himself unable to move on. Superficial conversations, unfunny jokes, attempts at distraction that only made him feel even more alone. That emptiness inside him seemed denser and more impenetrable with each passing day. The future seemed like a giant question mark. He simply didn't know how to get out of where he was. The pain of having lost everything was becoming increasingly apparent. He couldn't wait to wake up. He saw no reason to continue. Michael found himself in a desert, alone, with the ghosts of his past haunting every thought. Like a boat adrift in the ocean, he didn't know where he was going, or if there was a destination. He thought he might simply sink there, to the bottom of the well. But as in every great story of overcoming, loneliness and despair are just the beginning. A tortuous beginning, a period of trial, but also the starting point for something greater. Something Michael didn't yet know, but would soon discover. That darkness is often where the stars begin to shine. Whether you identify with Michael's story or feel lost and directionless, be sure to follow this journey. Share with someone who also needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this epic transformation. What comes next will surprise you. Michael woke earlier than usual that day, not because he wanted to, but because sleep no longer made sense. There had been weeks when he hadn't been able to sleep properly, when thoughts had dragged like a heavy weight on his mind. He didn't know what made him get out of bed, or if there was even a reason to do so. Everything seemed pointless. But at that moment, a strange sensation invaded him, as if something were trying to open up inside him. He picked up his phone, as he did every morning, hoping for some unexpected message or call to bring a glimmer of hope. But there was nothing. Just a blank screen. No messages. No missed calls. Just another silent reminder that, in his life, things were out of control. He sat on the edge of his bed, looked out the window, and saw the gray sky, typical of a colorless day. But for some reason, something inside him told him it was time to face his grief head on. It was time to reflect on all he had lost, and perhaps more importantly, on what he still carried within him. It was a strange feeling, as if he'd lived in a world where he'd made his own choices, but he'd never really reflected on them. What was he doing with his life? What had he accomplished so far? He thought about the job he'd lost, the relationship that had fallen apart, and the devastating loss of his mother. He'd always believed he was doing what he should, working, building, maintaining the image of someone successful. But when he stopped to think, he realized he'd never really questioned whether what he was pursuing was truly what he wanted. He was, in some way, living to please others, to fit into society's expectations, and not to be satisfied with his own choices. Why am I doing all this? He thought. What do I really want from my life? The reflection began to intensify. Michael felt a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of regret and disillusionment, but also a strange sense of relief. It was as if, for the first time, a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, simply by realizing that his choices up until then had not been made with his heart. He was living according to what he believed was right, but without understanding why this left him feeling so empty. He remembered his youth, full of dreams and hopes, before he lost himself in the responsibilities and pressures of the world. Where were those dreams now? They had been forgotten, buried under the monotony of adulthood, under the pressure to succeed, to please others. Michael realized that by trying to fill the voids in his life with these external expectations, he had distanced himself, from who he truly was, and from what he truly desired. Michael's gaze began to wander, remembering the good times, the moments of simplicity and happiness he shared with his mother before everything fell apart. He smiled to himself, remembering her saying that happiness didn't come from possessions, career, or status. True happiness comes from being true to yourself and others, she always said. Those words, which he had often ignored, now resonated in his mind with disconcerting clarity. He felt a tightness in his chest, the pain of loss, once again hitting him hard. But amidst this pain, something began to happen. Michael began to realize that he couldn't move forward, carrying all the weight of the past. He couldn't continue harboring resentment, guilt, or regret. If he truly wanted change, he would need to leave behind everything that tied him to what no longer existed. He needed to let go. It was difficult. The pain of loss was still there, raw, pulsing within him. But little by little, he began to understand that this process of reflection wasn't just about understanding what he'd lost, but about understanding what still needed to be released, what needed to be left behind, so he could move toward something new. He knew he couldn't carry the burdens of the past, the broken expectations, the mistakes made, and wait for a new future to emerge. For him to achieve what he truly desired, he needed to make room for something different. Michael knew that to move forward, he needed to let go. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary. Letting go, however, didn't mean forgetting. It meant releasing the pain, guilt, mistakes, and regrets that still haunted him, and finding the strength to make different choices. Letting go meant accepting that not everything was under his control, and more importantly, that he didn't need to continue blaming himself for every failure or pain he had experienced. He looked at the small photo album on the table, filled with memories that had once been important, but now represented a distant past. He didn't know if he should keep those photos, but he felt he should no longer look to them as a reference point. Michael closed the album, setting it aside, making a symbolic gesture. He didn't want to forget the good memories, but he needed to stop living for what was and focus on what could be. He needed to let go of what no longer served him, not only to make room for new experiences, but also to learn to live more authentically. Detachment at that moment wasn't just about physical things or objects. It was an emotional detachment. He needed to learn to free himself from the memories that kept him trapped in the past. He needed to understand that by clinging to all those memories of pain and loss, he was denying himself space for something new, for the chance to rise again. Michael looked up at the sky, the sun already beginning to peek over the horizon, softly illuminating what had previously seemed like an endless day. He didn't have all the answers, nor did he know exactly what the future held. But now he knew he was ready to begin letting go. And as the world around him began to take on a different tone, Michael also began to feel a strange lightness, a new sensation, as if for the first time he were freeing himself from an unbearable weight, a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying until that moment. What now? What would come next? What would Michael do with this new space he had created within himself? If you've ever felt lost like Michael, or if you're at a point in your life where you need to reflect and let go of something in order to move forward, Be sure to follow this journey of self-discovery and transformation. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel to see what's next. The best is yet to come. The morning light was already illuminating the room, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that somehow the darkness still lingered within him. He had taken an important step in trying to let go of the memories that held him captive. But the void that remained was not something easy to fill. The silence inside his mind was deafening. In that silence, he found himself facing a much deeper and more intimately frightening challenge: his own fears. He didn't know if he was ready for what lay ahead. Even with the decision to move forward, to try to get back on his feet, a cruel doubt consumed him. Am I capable of changing? The question repeated in his mind like an echo, growing louder and harder to ignore. He knew the pain of loss couldn't be the only thing that defined him, but at the same time, he felt paralyzed by uncertainty. The fear of failure was so strong that he wondered if he had the strength to start over. Michael sat on the couch, staring at the living room walls. Everything seemed so empty and lifeless. It wasn't just the house that was like this. It was him. He saw himself as a broken man, unable to regain control, unable to find himself again. The fear of failing again, of falling once more, was heavier than any other obstacle he could face. And in his mind, he asked himself, what if I try and fail again? What if what I strive for is something I can never achieve? These thoughts haunted him day after day. In his self-talk, he found himself reminiscing about past failures: the failed job, the failed relationship, the pain of losing his mother, which in some ways he still couldn't fully process. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, he was a failure. How could he ever have the courage to try something new? How could he ever believe he could start over? He looked at the books and papers on his desk, the promises of new beginnings, and the motivational advice that had been his companions these past few days. He picked them up and put them aside, unable to follow any of the advice. How could he move forward if he had no idea how? There was a fear even deeper than external failure. The fear that he no longer had the capacity to trust himself, to believe he could rewrite his story. With each step he tried to take to escape this spiral, doubt gripped him more deeply. Did he have the strength to change his life? He no longer knew who he was. And even more so, he feared he wouldn't be able to find the purpose that had once driven him. His greatest fear wasn't failure itself, but the fear of not being enough, of not being able to handle the obstacles that lay ahead. Beyond the fear of failure, there was the fear of showing vulnerability. Over the years, Michael had shielded himself emotionally. He learned to hide his insecurities and create a facade of security. But the loss of everything forced him to confront his vulnerability. He was now exposed, stripped of the armor he had built throughout his life. He feared showing his fragility to others, feared being seen as weak and incapable. What if no one believed I could change? He didn't know if he was ready to deal with other people's opinions, with their judgment. What would others think of him? After everything that had happened, the fear of rejection consumed him. He wondered if it would be worth trying again, if the pain of rejection wouldn't be even worse than the loneliness and grief he was immersed in. There were times when he wanted to disappear, to be unseen, to avoid any confrontation with the outside world. But this only made him feel more trapped, smaller. The desire to protect himself isolated him even further. But at some point, and Michael couldn't remember exactly when, he realized something that made him pause. He sat silently in the back of the room, hands on his temples, trying to ward off the storm of thoughts that overwhelmed him. And then, the answer began to come. He began to understand that fear, however paralyzing, was also a sign that he was alive. The fear of starting over wasn't an insurmountable obstacle, but an opportunity to show himself what he was truly capable of. He realized he was afraid because he still had something to lose. And this, however, difficult it was to accept, meant he was still in the process of transformation. Michael stood up suddenly, as if an invisible impulse had pushed him. He knew the pain wouldn't go away overnight. He knew there would still be moments of doubt and suffering. But he finally understood something profound. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to take the first step. True strength didn't come from never failing or being unafraid, but from continuing to walk despite the fear, from continuing to believe, even when everything seemed uncertain. At that moment, something inside Michael ignited. It wasn't an absolute certainty that he could do it, but a faint flame of courage that had been rekindled. He knew that true change began there, the moment he decided that despite his fear, he would try. And that, in itself, was a great victory. He was no longer trying to find perfection. He wasn't trying to avoid pain. He was trying, from that moment on, to be the man he'd long feared he couldn't be. Someone capable of moving forward. Someone who wouldn't let fear define his future. And now, with a new understanding, Michael looked to the future. The path ahead was still unclear, but he finally felt he could take the next step. The fear hadn't gone away, but he had something stronger within him now. The resolve to continue, to fight to rewrite his story, even if the path was arduous. If you, like Michael, doubt your own strength to start over, remember that fear is just a sign that you're about to do something big. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue following this journey of transformation and overcoming. The next chapter will be a milestone in Michael's journey, and it could be yours too. After weeks of doubt and fear, Michael's day finally seemed to have a new energy. Something inside him was beginning to stir, silently but surely. It was no longer the pain that consumed him. Something deeper, more visceral, was beginning to emerge. A spark, a flicker of something new. He didn't yet know what it was, but he felt he was beginning to see a way out. A path that, though tortuous, seemed promising. He spent hours silently in the corner of his apartment, reflecting on the choices he had made, the emptiness he felt inside, and most of all, the things he truly loved. He remembered his mother, and how she always told him, "Life only has meaning when you follow what your heart tells you." Those words, which had once sounded like distant advice, now seemed like a clear whisper, as if his mother were somehow there, guiding him. But he still didn't know which direction to take, what his heart truly desired. It was one morning, while organizing a small stack of papers on his desk, that he came across an old photograph. It was a photo from a trip he took with his mother years ago. They were in a small village surrounded by mountains, in a place he never imagined he would ever return to. Looking at that image, a feeling of nostalgia and connection filled his chest. He remembered something he had almost forgotten: his passion for photography. From a young age, he had been captivated by the art of capturing moments, by the way an image could tell an entire story. At the time, it seemed like a distant dream. But today, looking at that photo, he realized something vital. Photography was the last thing that made him feel alive, that made his heart beat faster. He stood up, with an unexpected impulse, and went to the closet. He pulled out a box where he kept his old cameras, the lenses he hadn't used in years. There, amid the dust and grime of time, he found his first camera, the same one he'd used on so many trips, the same one that had captured his mother's smile in that photo. The camera was cold, lifeless, but he felt an immediate connection, a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in a long time. Michael sat on the floor, camera in hand, and a wave of emotion washed over him. He looked through the lens, seeing the world from a different perspective. The simple act of focusing the lens felt like the first thing in a long time he'd done with intention, with purpose. And in that moment, he realized he'd found something to hold on to, something that wasn't pain, something that wasn't fear, but something that truly belonged to him, his passion for photography. That was the key. He knew he couldn't simply return to the past, couldn't simply wait for life to return to the way it had been. But photography, this art he had left behind, could be the first step. What the world needed now wasn't another stressful job, or another repetitive, soulless life. What he needed was something that connected him to what truly mattered to him, something that inspired him to keep going. The idea of a new purpose began to take shape in his mind. He could start over through photography. He could find beauty in the world again, through the lens of his camera, capturing simple and extraordinary moments. Photography, more than a career, could be a way to reconnect with life, with humanity, and perhaps even with himself. But there was something else Michael understood in that moment. He didn't need to be perfect to begin. He didn't need to have everything figured out. The simple act of following his passion, of taking a first step, was enough. He wasn't starting from scratch. He was starting from where he'd lost his way, but now with a new focus, a new vision. In the following days, Michael began leaving the house more often, camera in hand, exploring the city, observing the details, the small beauties he had never noticed before. He took photos of busy streets, everyday scenes, unfamiliar faces. Each click of the camera was a small victory, a reminder that he still had something to offer, still had something to live for. But it wasn't just about the images he captured. It was about what he was learning by reconnecting with the world, by seeing everything through the lens of his camera. He began to see beauty in what had previously seemed trivial. A tree swaying in the wind, the soft light of dawn, the smile of a stranger. Everything, however simple, began to have meaning. And that was how Michael began to find a new purpose. Photography gradually transformed into something deeper. It was his form of expression, his way of understanding the world, and ultimately of understanding himself. With each photo taken, Michael felt closer to something he couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was inner peace. Perhaps it was a connection with his true essence. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he felt he was getting closer to something that could truly change his life. Over time, Michael began investing more in photography. He enrolled in online courses, began studying techniques, and practiced constantly. He was no longer chasing instant success or a grand career. What he wanted now was to dedicate himself to his passion, learn, grow, and perhaps tell stories through the images he captured. He understood that deep down, the greatest motivation didn't come from something external. It came from within, from the desire to do something that connected him to what he truly loved, that made him feel alive. Each click of his camera was a new beginning, a step toward the future he was beginning to build. If you're also searching for something that moves you, something that sparks your passion, remember that sometimes it takes a moment of introspection to find what truly matters. If you identified with Michael's journey and believe you're ready to begin your own transformation, share with anyone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel. The first step is always the hardest, but it is where real change begins. Michael's first steps on his new journey weren't easy, and he knew it. Photography was beginning to become his passion again, but he soon realized that following a dream wasn't as simple as clicking a camera and waiting for life to fall into place. Each victory came with a new obstacle, and this time, he couldn't run away from them. He had to face them head-on. The first major challenge he faced was financial. Michael knew that to truly dedicate himself to photography, he would need more equipment, more resources, and perhaps even a space to set up his own studio. However, his salary from a job he barely remembered, combined with the fact that he was still paying off debts accumulated from the loss of his previous job, put him in a difficult position. Things were tight. He had to compromise on certain things, such as going out less, cutting down on distractions, and even sacrificing leisure time, which affected his emotional well-being. He began cutting expenses wherever he could, even swapping his daily coffee for a simple cup of tea at home. In his mind, every small sacrifice aligned with his larger goal, but the early days of financial struggle weren't easy. Sometimes, he wondered if he was even on the right track. The numbers in his bank account didn't seem to support his decision. How would he make it work without the financial support he so desperately needed? That's when he had an idea. He didn't need state-of-the-art equipment to get started. He remembered taking pictures with his first camera, the one he'd found months earlier. It was simple, but it was also the one that connected him to his true love of photography. Michael began looking for more affordable alternatives, buying used lenses, using free photo editing tools, and most importantly, taking photos outdoors, taking advantage of natural light and the world around him. He knew the technique would come with time. The important thing was to start with what he had. The second obstacle he faced was emotional. After months, or even years, of feeling empty, Michael found himself challenged once again to believe in himself, to allow himself to grow, to allow himself to be a better person. Deep down, he feared that his own ghost would drag him back. The loss of his job, the end of a relationship, and the death of his mother were still fresh in his memory, and he often felt a growing anger, not only against the circumstances that had placed him in such a situation, but also against himself. Why didn't I do more? Why did it take me so long to realize what really mattered? These thoughts kept coming up. Whenever he felt weakest, most vulnerable, Michael began to realize that this kind of negative thinking couldn't be part of his new journey. When he was at his lowest, he tried to keep his mind occupied, trying to see beauty in the little things, even if it was just a click of his camera. But there were days when loneliness became a shadow that was difficult to shake. It was as if he were fighting a constant battle, not against the outside world, but against his own reflection in the mirror. He could no longer allow himself to be trapped in that cycle of self-pity. Another obstacle arose when he realized that, by focusing so much on himself, he was distancing himself from the people around him. The few friends he had left began to notice the change in him. Some encouraged him to pursue photography. Others suggested he get a real job, that photography wasn't for someone his age. But Michael felt that by passively accepting this advice, he would be returning to the same place he'd tried to escape. The loneliness became more intense when he realized that not everyone around him believed he could achieve what he wanted. For others, photography was just a hobby, something to have fun with, not a way to live. The social pressure on him to be and do was immense. Michael often felt as if he were swimming against the tide. What would be easier? Returning to his old routine, adapting to the expectations of those around him, or allowing himself to be who he truly was, even if it meant being misunderstood. Over time, he understood that the greatest social obstacle came not from others, but from himself. He feared being judged, feared not being accepted as someone who was trying to follow his passion instead of doing the right thing, as he thought he should. He also knew that many around him wouldn't understand, and this made him question his own courage. Am I really capable of doing this alone? That thought haunted him often. But then he remembered the photograph. He remembered how it had always made him feel true, free, and that memory was what kept him going. Amidst external obstacles, Michael held firm, resolving that he couldn't give up now. He knew the journey would be long and challenging, but something inside him had shifted. He wouldn't let financial, emotional, or social obstacles stop him. He couldn't once again let life drag on. With each photo he took, with each new click, he saw the evolution not only of his skills but also of his inner vision. One day, after taking some photos of a local market, Michael had an idea. He decided to set up an exhibition, even if it was in a small cafe or neighborhood shop, to showcase his photos. He knew the investment was high, but he believed the return would not be financial, but emotional. He was reconnecting with the world, with his truth. He knew the risk of failure was there, but at the same time, he understood that this was the price he had to pay for the freedom to be who he truly was. And that's what Michael did. He gathered what little money he had, put on the exhibition, and invited people to see what he was creating. With each new positive feedback, each sincere compliment, he felt he was on the right track. With each comment, he knew the pain of financial hardship, loneliness, and fear had been worth it. He understood that hardships weren't obstacles to his victory, but rather proof that he was on the right path. Each challenge he overcame was a reminder of his strength, his resilience, and most importantly, his ability to move forward, no matter how much life tried to stop him. Michael had found the strength he needed within himself. Now, more than ever, he knew that the real obstacle wasn't the outside world, but what he believed was possible in his life. And little by little, he freed himself from all the limitations he once thought insurmountable. If you're also facing obstacles along the way, remember that every challenge you overcome is a step toward achieving your dreams. Don't let external obstacles define your future. Like, share with someone who needs motivation, and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapter of this journey of overcoming. You're closer than you think. After months of dedication, sacrificing virtually everything he owned, Michael was on the verge of despair. His efforts to make a living from photography had yielded modest results, but he still couldn't see a way to turn his passion into something truly sustainable. An exhibition of his photos at the local cafe had some positive impact, but it wasn't enough to bring about the change he'd hoped for. His bank was nearly empty, and he no longer knew who to turn to for help. His friends were busy with their own lives, and he didn't want to be a burden to anyone. His rent was late, and the thought of eviction was increasingly haunting him. The hours he'd spent taking photographs, trying to improve his skills, now seemed in vain. The days were growing longer and heavier, and the feeling of helplessness was beginning to creep in again. Michael began to consider giving up. Maybe it was time to accept reality and go back to looking for a normal job, as he always had. The fear of failure, the feeling that there was no way out, made him question whether this path was worth it. He was tired of fighting, tired of battling his own insecurities, his lack of money, the judgment of others, and expectations he felt he would never meet. Victory seemed a distant illusion. Every step he took toward his dream felt like taking 2 steps back. It was in one of these moments of despair that something unexpected happened. Michael had gone for another solitary walk, his camera in hand, trying to capture the beauty of the world around him, despite the anguish that consumed him. He was in the park, watching children play and couples strolling, when he was approached by a middle-aged man with a calm, confident energy. The man, who appeared to be a simple passerby, asked, "You're a photographer, right? I've seen you with your camera several times around here." Michael, surprised, looked at him, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being noticed, much less recognized for his art, which until then he'd seen as something too small for others to notice. But the man seemed genuinely interested. "Yes," Michael replied hesitantly. "I'm a photographer, but I'm not sure I'm good enough." The man smiled and stepped closer. "Don't underestimate yourself. I own a local gallery, and I'm looking for new talent. I've seen your work, and it has something unique about it. Have you ever considered exhibiting your photos in a gallery?" Michael wasn't sure he understood. Was the man serious? A gallery? The idea of exhibiting his work in such a professional venue seemed absurd. He was financially strapped, still struggling to pay the bills. How could he suddenly exhibit his photographs in such a significant way? But the man didn't seem to be joking. He introduced himself as Tom, the owner of a small but respected art gallery in the city. He had followed Michael's work on social media, and although he was still a beginner, he felt there was something authentic in his photographic approach. He saw something beyond the images, something emotional, something that could only come from someone truly connected to what they were doing. Tom mentioned an exhibition he was organizing and suggested that Michael participate, even though he didn't have a ready-made collection or a large portfolio. The proposal was bold. Michael could exhibit his photos at the upcoming event, alongside more established photographers. Of course, he would have to pay a small fee to participate, but Tom offered special conditions given his situation. At first, Michael thought it was a joke. How could he, someone so new to the business, have the chance to work alongside real professionals? But Tom's sincere gaze and the confidence he demonstrated in his work made him think differently. Maybe this is the chance I need, Michael thought. He didn't know if he was ready, but he also knew he had nothing to lose. He was at rock bottom, and any chance to change his reality seemed like a gift from fate. Even with the financial risks, even with the insecurity, he accepted. In the days that followed, Michael dove headfirst into the process. He reviewed every photo he'd taken, selected the best, and processed them with more care than ever before. He spent days and nights editing, recalling significant moments, and choosing images that not only showcased his technique, but also conveyed the emotion he felt while capturing them. The effort was enormous, and at the same time, deeply rewarding. Michael began to see the images differently. He was connecting with them in a new way, feeling that finally, what he was creating had a purpose, not just for himself, but for everyone else who saw it. He realized that regardless of the amount of money or immediate success, there was something greater there, the true expression of his soul. As the Aya exhibition date approached, the challenges continued. He still didn't have enough money to cover all expenses, but he continued to rely on Tom, who became not only an ally, but also a mentor of sorts. Michael received advice on how to set up the exhibition, how to interact with guests, and how to conduct himself professionally, even though he was new to the field. On the night of the exhibition, the space was packed. People from all over the city began to show up, and for Michael, it felt like an impossible dream come true. People were commenting on his photos, admiring the landscapes and portraits he had captured. The interaction with others, the way he saw his work being appreciated, made his confidence grow with each passing minute. At the end of the evening, something extraordinary happened. An art collector who was present at the event became interested in one of Michael's photographs. He didn't just like it, he bought it. Michael couldn't believe what was happening. He was selling his art. He was being recognized. It was the first of many sales that followed. Michael found a new purpose, a new direction. He was no longer in the position of someone struggling to survive. He had found his path, and now his work was beginning to be recognized. Michael's turnaround was proof that even when victory seems impossible, it can come when you least expect it. He was at a point where, looking back, it seemed like nothing would work out. But the moment he decided to accept help, trust, a new ally, and take a bold step into the unknown, things began to change. And with that, he realized that true victory came not just from external success, but from the internal strength to never give up, even when all seemed lost. If you also believe that your victory may be closer than you think, remember, sometimes the solution you're looking for comes from the most unexpected place. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue following this exciting journey. The best is yet to come. What seemed like the end for Michael turned out to be the beginning of something great. Looking back, he couldn't have imagined that the lowest point in his life would be the foundation of his greatest victory. He had lost everything: his job, his relationship, his family, and even his own confidence. But when he hit rock bottom, it was there that he found what truly mattered. It was in the chaos of loss that he discovered his true passion, his true strength, and the courage to rise again. Michael had faced an internal battle that no one saw, but which had shaped him profoundly. When he began to believe again, when he dared to take the first step without knowing what awaited him, he didn't know he was about to reinvent himself. Photography, which he had once cast aside, became the portal to his transformation, to his true expression of life. He reconnected not only with a passion, but also with the purpose of becoming the best version of himself. He had given himself a chance, and that chance led him back to life. The path was not easy. He faced financial hardship, the constant fear of failure, the loneliness of difficult choices. But with each obstacle overcome, with each photo taken, he discovered a little more of who he truly was. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadow of the past. He became the creator of his own destiny, someone capable of transforming pain into art, loss into achievement. Now, facing the gallery that had welcomed him, Michael felt an indescribable satisfaction. It wasn't just the exhibition before him. It was the reflection of an epic journey of overcoming obstacles. He had achieved something that seemed impossible, the freedom to be who he truly wanted to be. He found himself not only accepted by the world, but more importantly, accepting himself. Amidst the success of his sales and the recognition he began to receive, he knew that true victory wasn't in the applause or the money. True victory was internal transformation, the feeling that he had rebuilt himself from scratch. He had lost everything, but in the process, he had found something far more valuable: confidence in his own ability to create, to start over, to live according to his own heart. He had taken a leap of faith, and now he was reaping the rewards of his courage. Michael's journey isn't just a story about achieving success. It's a story about resilience, about the invisible force that drives us to keep going, even when life throws us against the wall. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in achieving what we seek, but in learning to fight for what truly matters, to forgive ourselves, and to never give up, no matter how many times the world knocks us down. Now, Michael knows that losing everything was actually the first step to his greatest achievement. He not only rose again, but overcame it. He not only conquered photography as a career, but conquered himself. If you also believe there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, that every major obstacle can be the key to a new journey. Like this video, share it with someone who needs motivation, and subscribe to the channel. Your big victory may be closer than you think. Believe me, the best is yet to come.